Welcome to the first in a series of videos on emptiness. I wanted to explore this concept that I was seeing come up in many different spiritual traditions, from Taoism to Buddhism, different Hindu ideologies, Kabbalah, Hermeticism. I was finding similar concepts by different names, but I wanted to explore what they had in common, and I thought it would be a fun little project. So here we have the first that we're going to explore today. It comes from the Taoists. The Taoists called it Wuji. If you'll have to forgive my pronunciations. If we look at literal translations, we see it called without ridgepole, which as we explore Buddhism, we'll see what Buddha meant when he talked about the ridgepole. But there are, especially when we're translating from different languages to English, there are often many interpretations, many translations, and some of them speak to you more than others. So we'll do our best to look at more than just one. We'll try and get a broad perspective of translations. We see here it's a compound of the nothingness concept of Wu and Ji, meaning extremity or utmost. So extreme nothingness or the utmost nothingness. Wu here we see translated as without, no, none, non, where there are no. And Ji, similarly having multiple translations, limits, extreme, end, ultimate, extreme boundary. So if we put those together in a random order, it could be no extreme or no limits, without end, without extreme boundaries. And just to finish off on the translation note here, ultimateness or limitlessness, the ultimate of nothingness, that which has no pole or non-polar. Next, I would love to just give a brief look at different places in written documents where emptiness has come up, or here we have Wuji where it has come up. So we see Wuji coming up in Taoism, Confucianism, and the School of Names, which is also goes by the Logicians or the School of Names. And so what we can see all the way from 4th century before Common Era to the 11th century. So we have a span of 1500 years. And, here we are in 2022 AD still talking about it. And I'm sure contemporary writers will still mention it. But we do have this huge pool to draw on, with the first mention coming from Lao Tzu in the 4th century before Common Era. And then we have these other expressions, these other documentations of Wuji coming up. So we will dive into them a little bit more and see what they have to say and what they have in common. The first time Wuji came up in text was, like we said, from Lao Tzu in the Tao Te Ching. And more than once, it came up many times in this famous text. If we look at chapter 28 from Victor Mayer's 1990 translation of the Tao Te Ching, we'll see he wrote, "No whiteness, maintain blackness, and be a model for all under heaven. By being a model for all under heaven, eternal integrity will not err. If eternal integrity does not err, you will return to infinity." And here we have infinity highlighted it because that is where we had the word Wuji. So he's talking about returning to this emptiness, as we loosely define, or this without limits, this Wuji. So this is one example. And I think it's interesting here that he's talking about a return. It's not, so this is kind of setting us up for a deeper understanding, because the goal here is to understand what they meant when they wrote about Wuji. And it's, I think, perhaps one of the most difficult concepts to understand is this concept of emptiness or nothingness, because the fact that I'm here talking implies somethingness. So how can we actually wrap our heads around these things? And here we have this very esoteric teaching talking about returning to infinity. And so let's continue to explore here. This is another chapter, a different translation, this one coming from 2003 by Jonathan Starr. But again, it is referring to the Tao Te Ching. And here we'll read, "Become totally empty. Quiet the restlessness of the mind. Only then will you witness everything unfolding from emptiness. See all things flourish and dance in endless variation, and once again merge back into perfect emptiness, their true repose, their true nature, emerging, flourishing, dissolving back again. This is the eternal process of return. To know this process brings enlightenment. To miss this process brings disaster. Be still. Stillness reveals the secrets of eternity. Eternity embraces the all-possible. The all-possible leads to a vision of oneness. A vision of oneness brings about universal love. Universal love supports the great truth of nature. The great truth of nature is Tao. Whoever knows this truth lives forever. The body may perish, deeds may be forgotten, but he who has Tao has all eternity. Chapter 16. Here again we are getting more insight into what this Wuji stands for, and it's talking about this enlightened state, this place where being in harmony with the universe allows you to return to, he says, this perfect emptiness, talking about the things unfolding from emptiness and then returning to emptiness. So we're starting to see it as not this place of voidness in which nothing exists, but the eternal source and the return to which all of our material world presumably comes from and goes to. So those were from the 4th century, the first times we were seeing Wuji written. And here we're going to jump ahead all the way to the 11th century, in where we have the Taijitu Shuo, and we have an explanation of the diagram of the Supreme Ultimate. So what we have on the right here is this diagram coming from those centuries ago, and this was the cornerstone of Neo-Confucianist cosmology. We have a little writing here. His brief text synthesized Confucius metaphysics of the I Ching with aspects of Taoism and Chinese Buddhism. So here, this one coming 1500 years approximately after the Tao Te Ching, and we see references to the I Ching, which is another ancient spiritual text, I Ching interpreted as, or translated as, the Book of Changes, which is an ancient divinatory system used by these Taoists, the Taoists. And so here we have this diagram merging these different schools of thought coming out of China. So we have Chinese Buddhism and Taoism and Confucianism. So this is merging these together. In the Taijitu diagram, Wuji is represented as a blank circle and Taiji as a circle with a center point or with broken and unbroken lines. When we start to look at the I Ching and what they talked about, they have yin and yang, which represent this archetypal duality. Okay, so when we start to talk about duality, it exists at a very abstract level, but then it starts to take material manifestations in our material world. So we can create these oppositions of hot and cold or dry and wet. The Chinese, they famously have what they call the 8 trigrams, which are opposite energies. We have heaven and earth, fire and water, thunder and wind, the mountain and lake, which are expressions of duality. But existing in just an archetypal form, we have what we call yin and yang, or the active and the passive. Beyond any physical material expressions is just this archetypal duality. So what we see here in this diagram is emptiness, Wuji, represented by just the pure circle, which then manifests as this alternation of yin and yang with the world embryo in the middle, so the entire world coming from there. And the Chinese have a saying, from the emptiness comes the one, comes the two, comes the three, comes the 10,000 things. So from the emptiness comes the opposition, comes all of the things that manifest in our material world. So again, non-polar and yet supreme polarity. The supreme polarity in activity generates yang, yet at the limit of activity it is still. In stillness it generates yin. Yet at the limit of stillness, it is also active. Activity and stillness alternate. Each is the basis of the other. In distinguishing yin and yang, the two modes are thereby established. The alternation and combination of yang and yin generate water, fire, wood, metal, and earth. With these 5 phases of qi harmoniously arranged, the 4 seasons proceed through them. The 5 phases are simply yin and yang. Yin and yang are simply the supreme polarity. The supreme polarity is fundamentally non-polar, yet in the generation of the 5 phases, each one has its nature. So if we dig into that a little bit deeper, it's again just reiterating what I was beginning to say, in that we have these seemingly polar forces which emerge from the non-polar. Here we have a later rendition of the same diagram, but this is with English words instead, and it will further elaborate on it. And the single circle at the top of the Taijitu shuo represents Wuji, undifferentiated timelessness. What we see below, that is actually an early version of the yin-yang symbol, and represents the first movement into duality, the play of yin-qi and yang-qi. From the blending of yin-qi and yang-qi come the 5 elements: earth, metal, water, wood, and fire. From the 5 elements are born the myriad things of the world. Taoist practitioners enter into a path of return, of movement from the myriad things of the world back into Wuji. The immortals, or those who have entered the Tao, are those who have completed this path of return. The heart of Taoist cosmology, then, is the cycling between Tao and stillness and Tao and movement, between the unmanifest Wuji and the manifest Taiji, with the dance of yin and yang. Polarized phenomenon unfold from Wuji and then return to it, via the mechanism of Tai Chi. An important thing to keep in mind is that the manifest and unmanifest aspects of Tao are valued equally. Neither is accorded privileged status. The return of phenomenon to Wuji, to the unmanifest, can be understood as being something akin to getting a good night's sleep. It's wonderful and nourishing, but to say that sleep is the ultimate goal or final destination of your waking life would not be quite right. For a Taoist practitioner, the point is not to reject the phenomena of the world, but rather to understand them deeply, see them clearly, and embrace them with utmost intimacy. The benefit of Taoist practice is that it facilitates a more or less continuous communion with the inherent power of Wuji throughout all phases of the cycle, in the presence as well as in the absence of phenomenon. Here, to begin to wrap up, we have a beautiful commentary by Deng Ming-Dao, coming from a book, The Living I Ching. And I really enjoy this quote because he talks, again, very poetically about emptiness being the source rather than a voidness. Mathematics was limited until the discovery of zero. The study of change was not fully successful until we could conceive of emptiness as source. Emptiness is silence. It is not the stillness of the grave. It is midnight silence, when the wind rests, birds sleep, and the sun is hours from rising. It is the quiet that falls with snow, when the fields of labor are covered in white and trees have withdrawn into patience. That quietness is not the cessation of shouts, pounding feet, and pumping arms, but their origin. It is the source of day and the origin of spring. Silence is not the end. It is the beginning. Wuji is essential stillness, the packed potential before the beginning. It is the beginning of the beginning. Only after silence breaks into sound does emptiness become all things. So what we can garner from these sources that we've looked at today is that Wuji is this state upon which we emerge from and return to, and it is very much the goal of life to, as they say, the immortals have achieved this enlightenment, this return to this primordial state, which is fulfilling in itself and the goal of the spiritual life. So this has been our first look at emptiness. We've looked at Wuji, which has many translations, but it comes from the ancient Taoists as an expression of the source of the universe, the material world emerging from the emptiness. Next up, we're going to explore what the traditional Buddha, Siddhartha Gautama, had to say about emptiness. In their language, Pali language, it was called sunyata. And we'll see what they have in common, what they have differently as we continue to paint this picture of emptiness.